All right, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the series of CFP Perspectives lecture. Today we have with us Sundar Sarukkai. He is trained in physics, philosophy, and works primarily in the philosophy of the nature and the social sciences. He is the author of several books, the latest of which are The Social Life of Democracy, a response to the problems of global democracy today and extending Ambedkar's vision of social democracy. He is the series editor of Routledge Science and Technology Studies, as well as the co-chief editor of the Springer Handbook of Logical Thought in India. Shall we welcome him with an applause?
Thank you. Thank you. It's such a great pleasure and honor to be here to talk to all of you. Sept is, as I was telling your dean, it's been so much in our imagination, even though I come from Bangalore, and it's really an honor to share the dais with you and share some thoughts to you, especially as first year students who have just come into the program. I come from the discipline of philosophy, and you know philosophy and architecture have always been very closely linked. If you look at the development of major ideas in philosophy, particularly over the last 30, 40 years, they have been always in constant engagement with architecture. Particularly if you look at the traditions within philosophy of what is called modernity and postmodernism, there has been a very important engagement conversation between architects and philosophers. And very often I think architecture comes closest to applied philosophy in some sense. Many of the examples of philosophical concepts are often played out in architecture. So I want to use this opportunity. I did struggle with saying what am I going to say which might be meaningful to all of you, especially as new students in architecture. And I thought what I want to do is to show you why philosophy is meaningful to you by not talking about philosophy. I'm not going to talk about philosophy as a discipline at all. I want to just explore two fundamental concepts with you. I just want you to think with me about two concepts which are so important and so central to the human imagination. And in doing so, I'm asking you to forget about your disciplines. Don't think of yourself as art student, science student, right? And again, it's architecture which is at the intersection of arts and science. I remember when I teach some of the architecture students in Bangalore, we begin with one of the first definitions of architecture, which all architect students seem to love, and teachers also use it all the time, right? Architecture is the art and science of buildings. So there is some way in which architects wants to hold on to this some notion of the creative, the designing aspect of it, some imagination aspect related to what we call as art. And at the same time, you're also holding on to something about science. So part of what philosophers do, and I work largely, as I said, in philosophy of science, is to ask the meaning of what do you mean by saying architecture has some relation to science? What does science actually mean? What should I do if architecture should be a science? What should architecture be if it wants to see itself as art? Okay, those are, I'm just giving you examples of what philosophers would ask, what kind of questions interest us, right? So we are very interested in trying to understand concepts, trying to see how they are meaningful to you in your own discipline. So in that context, within that kind of a larger framework, I want to talk to you about two fascinating concepts, and I hope by the end of it you should be as excited about it as so many of us are, both of which are very central to architecture, and both of which are also very important for philosophy. And not just for philosophy, if you look at the case of symmetry, it's important to so many other disciplines. So I want to introduce you to the world of symmetry if you have not been introduced. I want to show you what a fascinating topic, the very complex, confusing topic which even today people, whether in science or art, haven't made sense of. There are a lot of very interesting ambiguities about the idea of symmetry. And if we thought symmetry was a tough concept, and if you thought you knew what space meant, I want to show you that space becomes a far more interesting and complex object for you. And it is something which you as architects are often going to be engaging with. So let me begin with uh, this observation, which has intrigued scientists. So I'm going to draw from very different disciplines. Okay, I am a nomadic. I move between disciplines in the way it suits me, my understanding of the world. So I'm going to do that and represent it here by looking at, first from looking at the context of science, then I want to look at from the context of art, and then architecture, and then let's see if we can make sense of what is this idea of symmetry. There's this interesting puzzle about nature. And what is this puzzle? You have seen all kinds of natural phenomena, natural objects in the world, like flowers and trees and human beings. We are all presumably products of nature in some sense. And there is some interesting relationship between all of them, commonality between many of the shapes of whether plants, animals, rock formations, cloud formations, things like snowflakes. They range from wide variety of things, but there seems to be some very commonalities which bind them in some sense. So if you look at the forms and shapes in nature, different kinds of, every object, like I said, a tree has a particular form, a flower has a particular form, animals have different forms. You notice something very interesting, that all of them, and when I say all, I'm dramatizing, but basically all of them have this property called symmetry. They're all symmetrical. And you'll have to ask, why is it? Why does nature produce objects? So let me give you one example, just as a very absurd example of symmetry. Just for you to imagine what I mean. When I'm standing in front of you, like all of us as human beings, we can stand like this. But imagine, the human body is a perfectly symmetrical body, and I'll talk about it a bit later. But imagine one leg was much longer than the other one. Imagine, ask yourself, what would it be to live? What does it mean to be a human being where one leg is like, short, other leg is long? What does it do to your idea of a human body? Right? So, if you look at all kinds of creatures this way, they seem to have some kind of a symmetrical pattern. And this ranges from the atomic, the molecular. Molecules show amazing symmetries. We famous ones, which even if you're not science students from biology, you remember DNA, helical structure. You look at almost all molecules, all chemical molecules, they'll have some kind of a symmetry. So I want to explore what is a symmetry. I'm using the word that they have some kind of symmetry. So let's assume you know what it means. Okay, and we'll explore later on what it could mean. It ranges from the smallest atoms to the largest galaxies. Why is it that the shapes of atoms and molecules at such small levels, right? You can't even see it through a microscope, to something like galaxies, which are huge. They're so huge you can't see them, and they're so far away. They all seem to have an order, a structure to the shape. That is what I mean loosely now as symmetry. So, this is a puzzle, as I said, for scientists. It ranges from not just microscopic galaxies to living and non-living forms, the way in which mountains are formed, and the way in which a nation's boundaries are formed, by the way. They show this particular principal character of symmetry. It, of course, represents itself so deeply within the human shape, and I'll discuss that a little bit more. And then, if you move beyond nature, it also is present across a wide variety of human activities, ranging from art, painting, sculpture, music. All of them have some principle of symmetry integral to them. Of course, architecture, and I'll look at some examples, languages, music, sports, and so on. So, the question which people would like to ask is this: it seems to be present everywhere. I use the word symmetry across all these disciplines, but what exactly do we mean by symmetry? And if I understand what symmetry is, can I give an account of why it is so ubiquitous? Why is it present everywhere? So that has been something very important for scientific exploration within science. And when I come to science, I'll tell you why it's so important. So just to give you an example of what I mean by symmetry, when I say nature is filled with symmetry, this seems, it has some order. So roughly, without one asking what is symmetry, you might say that this is a very symmetrical object, and I presume you can see some kind of an order. So let's use the words order and pattern for shorthand for symmetry. But you can look at it very deeply and ask, what kind of pattern does it have? What is it? What is symmetrical about this? You can also look at, there are, as I said, there is almost no natural object in the world which doesn't show some kind of a complex symmetry. Okay? And by symmetry here, right now, I want you to just ask yourself rather than telling you what it is. I want you to start thinking. I'm you keeping going on using the word. What might I mean by using the word symmetry? What is really symmetrical about this? You know, you can see it. You can see something is happening here. I don't know if you feel that there is something interesting about this. Um, okay, let me just take a quick call. Maybe I'm not supposed to do this, but what do you think could be symmetrical in this? I'm using the word symmetry, right? What do you think I could be talking about? What do you see in this picture, for example? Take a call. I mean, if you don't know what it is, don't worry. None of the great scientists and philosophers also know what symmetry is. So we are all in the same boat. But we are just thinking together about this, right? What do you think could be symmetrical in this? Can I just use the word, oh, it's circular, it's ordered? Would that work too? Would that be fine? Or should I use an extra word called symmetry just to confuse all of you? Yeah, you had something to say? What is the balance? What is balance? Yeah. Okay, so it's very interesting. I'm asking this, as I said, balance is a very interesting, useful synonym for this. But, when I ask you what balance is, you did something which is so important in the way we understand explanations within philosophy. What you did is you showed us what balance was. You're still saying, the body is performing what balance is, because balance, there is something about intuitively that you have this idea something is balanced, it's not balanced, but what is symmetry about it? Okay, I mean this answer is right, but I'll just try and clarify this. I'm just wanting to show you the kind of complexity of this. Of course, I mean, I can show you almost every creature, any creature you think of, from the smallest creatures like amoebas to the biggest ones. They will have, and some kind of symmetry, and this kind of symmetry, there is this kind of a balance, but it is so detailed that even these kinds of things are replicated. It's not just in the form. You're seeing it in the color, you're seeing it in the pattern, you're seeing it in the shapes, and it goes very deep in, if you look at the various kinds of symmetries present in creatures like this. And if you look at a little more complex thing, it's not just about the shape, it's about some very different kind of patterns on this animal that exactly it seems to mirror something. So all the examples I've shown you so far, at least the last two examples, have a mirroring principle. I hope you have noticed it. That is the right side. So you have something like this, and this side is like this, right? It's as if you put a mirror at one axis in the center, and the zebra. I hope this is a zebra. I haven't done biology for a long time. So there's one side, left side is mirrored in the right side. You put a mirror across yourself. Your left and your right, do they actually match? Is our left side a mirror image of the right side? Right? So the idea of symmetry, the question of balance, is coming from kind of a reflection. So that's already one step of understanding what symmetry could mean. But there are also very complex ones. So these last two are about mirrors. If you look at these sunflower seeds, it's one of the most interesting symmetries. I hope you're able to see this. The way in which the seeds in the center are distributed, it's not a simple circle. Can you see some kind of a shape in this? What do you think is a kind of a shape it could? What are you able to see? Does it look like a circle or square, triangle? No? So what is it? What do you think it looks like? Or can you see some kind of a form within that? This could actually be a design for a building. Maybe when you do some project, you can think about it this way. But can you see something very interesting about this? Okay, anybody wants to just take a guess? Yeah. Yeah, but what is a shape? Spirals. Can you see the spiral? In case, things going spiraling around. If you take a long term thing, can you see the seeds are distributed in a kind of a spiral? Why, for such a complex building, nature has built this? Why does it go and build this in such a complex manner? So you see why this question interests people a lot. This is another example, of course. There are some of the pictures on Symmetry are so beautiful. You can keep looking at it, and this is a picture which I really like to see. And there are a lot of such wonderful pictures on galaxies. This is the Milky Way galaxy, and the Milky Way galaxy. It's such a huge. Okay, you can't even imagine what a galaxy is, right? Galaxies will have thousands and tens of thousands of stars. And we are just one star and some planets, and imagine thousands and thousands of stars, tens of thousands of stars, maybe overall galaxies may have millions of stars. What is this shape? How is it that this whole system of stars and objects like planets and asteroids, etc., it has a shape like this? Whenever people have looked at these kind of questions in very early time, even in particularly, there are very interesting arguments in Western philosophy. You have similar ones in Indian philosophy. This is the argument by design. When somebody sees something like this, or the sunflower, the argument was these things could not have happened accidentally. Somebody must have planned. How do you get a seed? I mean, a sunflower like that with such complex geometry, or a complete galaxy which seems not to be just dispersed in open space but coherent like this. This is a very symmetrical object. There are, you can see the spiral. There are also other kinds of symmetry in our. This is our Milky Way to which we belong to. So the question we begin with is to ask, like, what is it that symmetry seems to do? So, and immediately there are some quick answers to it. One, if you look at the case of beehives, which is also a wonderfully symmetric object, and I don't know, as architects, if I ask you, can you build a perfect beehive? I think only your teachers can tell you whether it's easy or not. I'm pretty sure it's a very difficult thing to build a kind of a beehive like bees do. So bees must be much smarter than us, at least as architects, right? And the termites. And if you look at all the kinds of things which insects and animals build, the buildings they build seem to be far more complex than what we can imagine, right? The beehives, what you find from the geometry of the beehives is that they are building it in this kind of a ordered figure, and that seems to have a particular function. The function is that that is the most optimal space for storing maximum amount of honey with using minimum amount of wax. Whenever you see the words repeatedly coming as maximum and minimum, which is optimization, optimal, given a particular space, how can you optimally use it for whatever reason? Like, if you go to IT companies now, given this hall, they'll say, how do I optimally make most people sit in it? Then you as architects will have to figure out a way. What is the geometry you're going to use to pack the maximum number of people in this room? For example, you're sitting like this, right? Do you think this is the most optimum way to pack people in? It's in fact a very interesting mathematical problem. It's called the tiling problem. For example, I have a space like this, and I ask you, what is the way in which I can tile it so all of them fit perfectly together? What kind of tiling should I do? There are a lot of very interesting ways in the tiling problem. It is just like, how do you design that space? And anytime you use this word maximum, minimum, you can recognize that you are seeing some idea of order and symmetry present there. The sunflowers is using what we call as a radial symmetry, and that's why you see the spiral. And as your friend said, it illustrates this very interesting mathematical sequence. There's a greater mystery behind symmetry and space, which I won't be able to talk to you today about, but I'm sure you can discuss it among yourselves. The fact that many of the natural world exhibits very complex mathematical patterns. The Fibonacci sequence is a very interesting sequence of numbers. And what is a sequence? It is nothing, I'm sure you can see all this. It's very clear from this that the sequence is nothing but a sequence of numbers where one number is nothing but the sum of the previous two numbers. So it'll be like actually 0, 1, 1. Then 1 plus 2 is 3, 2 plus 3 is 5, 3 plus 5 is 8, 5 plus 8 is 13, and so on. Now, this is just one game of numbers. You just put some numbers and you're saying, okay, this is the rule of the game. But it's quite astounding that a large number of processes in nature follow this kind of a Fibonacci sequence. follow the rules of this sequence. What is it? What does the natural world, the physical world, have to do with some numbers? Have to do with this thing, language called mathematics that we produce? Okay. Um, so if you where do you find the radial symmetry? You find that, as I said, if you count the number of seeds, spirals in a flower, in the sunflower that we saw, you find that they follow the Fibonacci sequence. And there are there are many such examples. So this is just to illustrate to you how exactly this sunflower seeds can be represented as spirals, and you can count the number of spirals and what kind of sequence they are, and so on. Okay. Just to illustrate to you this complex, it's not that easy to make sense of why these kinds of things are happening. So what is happening in the sunflower is when seeds are produced and distributed, they are ordered in a particular manner. And whenever you see something like that, you could ask why. Who is doing the ordering? I can imagine if I am ordering, let's say, chairs in this room. So let's say I want to imagine, I'm sure this is part of the design experiment you can do one day. If you're going to design the keeping the chairs in this room, you'll start with a bunch of chairs in the middle, and then you want to order it. You can order it like in the way in which the sunflower seeds are being ordered, two sides of spirals and so on. And you might ask, why am I going to do it? Is it the best way to fill all the chairs within the room? Or is it about aesthetic concerns? But whatever it is, you are deciding, right? You are deciding this is how I want to do. In nature, who is deciding that these complex patterns the seeds must follow? Why can't there be one teen seed which says, no, I'm not going to follow your rule? What is that principle which makes you think that this kind of ordering is so essential to everything that you do in nature? And what is very interesting about this Fibonacci sequence is it's not just for the sunflower. As I said, particularly this Fibonacci sequence occurs across many things. I mean, right from your basic sunflower and broccoli, cauliflower, the way in which the florets are distributed. There are so many of these examples, which I give you an example here. Tree branches. So you have a tree growing and it branches, and each branch branches out. Is there a rule for that? Is there a pattern in it? Is there an order? Is there a symmetry in it? And so on. And one of my own very interesting thing which I have found is when you talk about the human face, okay, I presume by now you already studied about golden ratio and stuff in architecture, right? All of you know about it. The Which is a very important principle of some kind of a symmetry in buildings. The human face also exhibits a golden ratio. And what is a golden ratio? The mouth and nose are each positioned at golden section of the distance between the eyes and the bottom of the chin. So the distance between the eyes and the bottom of the chin, and the relation between where the mouth and the nose are placed within this in a face. And then people go and measure it and say, hey, there's this kind of a golden section principle being duplicated in this just the facial thing. So people are tried to understand the nature of beauty in faces. Have often asked, is there some connection between these kind of symmetrical principles and our own notions of what we think is beautiful? Are there asymmetries in human face? So some artists argue that while the human face is symmetrical mirror wise, I put a mirror here, this side is somewhat apparently almost the same as this side, but yet in every human face there's a slight distortion. We are not perfectly mirror symmetric, but we are largely mirror symmetric. If you put a mirror right across me, at least in terms of form, the left and the right are mirror images of each other, but there is always a slight difference, slight deviation. And people who look at symmetry and aesthetics argue that it is a slight breaking of symmetry that produces an aesthetic experience, that produces a feeling of saying, hey, that's beautiful, or whatever it is. So that's a completely another thing. So one of the ways we understand the idea of symmetry is to say, well, there is a function of why these nature is ordered like this. It's the most efficient way. It maximizes all the kinds of stuff which we do. And as I said, this kind of symmetry, what I mean by mirror symmetry is a bilateral symmetry, is present across a wide variety of objects, living, non-living, small and large. And then we see that there's a proliferation of what is meant by symmetry in nature. And then you come to the question of art. If you look at art, which is it is a very interesting contrast with nature, because nature is that which is produced and available to you. You're not doing anything with it, it's there. And then you discover the so-called beauty of nature in its various forms. And then if you look at art as a human produced, some activity produced by humans, and then you find that even in art, the idea of symmetry plays a very interesting role, very important in the formulation of early theories of art. And you can see why. Because many of the early principles of art come in terms of mimicking nature. You draw these beautiful pictures of sunsets and mountains and valleys and waterfalls and so on. So you can imagine if there is a notion of beauty in nature because of this kind of order and symmetry, art too will have a principle like that. But art goes, it moves away a bit from that. But still, as a conceptual term in art, it's a very important principle. And so when artists talk about things like, as you said about the sunflower, they use terms like, when what do they mean by symmetry is a picture, a painting has many different elements in it. And the notion of balance, at least within the idea of formalism in art, is a very important idea, which is I have some notion of balance. It will not be as exact like we saw in the sunflower or human symmetry, but there is some notion of balance, and you'll have to figure out what that notion of balance. I'll just give you one or two examples and you can see that. People use terms like balance, harmony, etc. to indicate the role of some kind of a symmetry principle which you use within art. And like in nature, there are different types of symmetries which arise in various kinds of things. But one of the most important principles in art, because if you ask the question, what is art really compared to nature, the point you want to start with is to say, okay, I'm not asking you, so let me just say this, we can have a discussion about it. So for one useful way to understand the nature of art is to say art is related to certain aesthetic qualities or aesthetic properties. What do I mean by that? Just like this object has a property of color, let's say, a pink bottle, or it has a color pink or blue, so too this bottle can also possess other properties. So it has physical properties, right? The shape, size, the weight, whatever it is. It has color, it has texture. These are all the physical, sensory properties. But it can also possess something called an aesthetic quality. An aesthetic quality is that quality which is present in the object, perhaps, which makes you look at the object and say, oh wow, that's beautiful. For example, I'm using beauty as a term. You could even say that's ugly. It doesn't matter. Beauty is not only aesthetic quality. Ugly is also an aesthetic quality. What do I mean by an aesthetic quality? An aesthetic quality is one which, on perceiving the object, you have a particular experience of saying, you can't say, because if I say, oh, this is pink, wow, this is pink, then I tell you, no, I don't understand what is pink. Can you tell me why you call it pink? You say, no, look, see, this is a color. And if you can see the color, this color is what I call pink. Okay? So physical properties are not a problem. But when you say, wow, this is beautiful, and you say, what? Where is it beautiful? Can you show me what is beautiful in this? Where is the aesthetic quality present? So art actually, what is special about the idea of art, our experience with art, is this production of aesthetic qualities present in this object. And it is not obvious that we can all see it like we see the color pink. So art critics will tell you how to look at this object in order to quote unquote see or experience the aesthetic quality. Okay, so one could say, oh, this is beautiful, just like this is pink. But pink you see, but aesthetic quality we have to discover and be taught to see. Okay, so people would say that the importance of symmetry is because it produces a particular aesthetic quality, it produces a particular aesthetic experience. Like she was trying to explain balance, and using the body to explain balance, for example. You are saying, oh, there is something very interesting about this. This is also a very symmetrical object, and that experience is what you're trying to communicate through the idea of symmetry, for example. So symmetry does have this kind of a quality which incites in you a particular experience, right? Which makes you think. You're not just saying it's beautiful because of the pink color. Pink color, we all know. There is something else when you see a work of art which says, oh, that's very interesting, that's beautiful, ugly, whatever else it is. So this relationship between aesthetics and symmetry becomes very important when we come to architecture too. And that's why it allows you to say things like architecture is art and science of buildings, where when you're dealing with questions of symmetry, there is still a science component, which we saw in nature, and we'll also see how it functions in modern science, and also in the context of art. So symmetry as a concept is universal across disciplines, okay, and seems to occur in very many different ways. It is also present not just in very sophisticated forms of artistic communities, artistic practices. It occurs in most of our everyday practices. It occurs in all the forms of art which we call, if you want to make a distinction at all, but since people make distinctions, I'm telling you this: tribal art, folk art, and different kinds of art practices. There seems to be some kind of a symmetry, all thing. And a symmetry is such a principle in everything that you do. You go back and look at yourself and say, oh, I'm wearing a shirt. Is there a symmetry principle in my shirt? Is there a symmetry principle in the chairs you sit? Are you thinking of various kinds of how to relook? So what I'm saying is, if you use symmetry as a concept and ask yourself, how is my way I'm seeing the world changes when I use symmetry as a concept? Go back to the same rooms and ask yourself, what kind of symmetry is present in the room? And that's what concepts do. Concepts are so important, and why philosophy is obsessed with understanding concepts, because concepts organizes your perception. And this is one of the first lessons I do when we teach philosophy. It is to say there's only one lesson in learning philosophy, which is to see is not just through our eyes. To seeing is not just opening our eyes and seeing the world. Seeing is to be taught. You have to be taught how to see. And how to see, how to teach, how to see a painting is part of your training in art. How to see a space, I'm sure, is part of the training in architecture. And once you do that, I'll come and see the space. Oh, yeah, space. But I have architect friends who come into a room and they see something completely different than what I can see. And I'm not trained to see like the way they can see. So, sight is not about the eyes, never about the eyes. It's about training on how to see something. And if you look at that, you can see your everyday life. Forget about all these fancy things. Everyday life is filled with principles of symmetry. And just go and explore it and see. You have examples, of course, like this Perugino's famous painting, which are obviously symmetrical, and there are many types of symmetry in this. An obvious symmetry is like you cut it in half, and there is a radial symmetry, and so on. But I just want to show you as an illustration of the kind of symmetries which have been very influential in painting. There have been many principles of symmetry which have been used. Leonardo da Vinci is a very famous example. Right from the idea of perspectives that you use in architecture, in architectural drawings, they're all related to questions of very deep questions of symmetry, by the way. Okay, and as I said, you can explore that later when you do this. If you look at this Van Gogh's painting, these are, you can already see there are very different kinds of symmetry already working here. It's not a simple mirror image. I may put a mirror in the middle. It is not. And a lot of painting tries to break that symmetry, because if it does the straight mirror, you'll say, it's okay, it's like a picture postcard. There is something in the quality of painting which should attract you, which might make you think. I mean, we can talk a lot about just this painting, but just I'll give you one example. And again, this is just a suggestion. You may say, no, it doesn't strike me, etc. But just to show you what kind of symmetry or what kind of balance there could have. There is something about this picture which some art critics will say, well, there is a kind of a balance which is happening, which is actually quite complex. Forget about those kind of spirals there. But this here is presenting a kind of a weight on that part. And then this here is presenting a counterweight to it. That is also a symmetry. Why? Because there is something which is, there is a symmetry across the diagonal. There are two weights. You can replace them as two weights at two ends of the thing. Now, what is interesting about this? Okay, it's something in philosophy. There's a tradition called phenomenology, and architecture's engagement with phenomenology is very deep. What is phenomenology? Phenomenology is the way you understand experience, the way human body, human mind, human structure experiences the world. That's a basic idea. Okay, and so when I'm seeing this, there is an experience of seeing which is present. What is the experience of seeing? Do you think you're just seeing this exactly like it is? I mean, all of you, hopefully all of you whose eyes are open so far, you're looking at this painting, and then you say, okay, have all of us seen the same painting? Do you think all of us would have seen the same painting? Actually, if we do a workshop and you're all sitting in my class, and if I tell you, I'll just show you this and say, oh, look, I'll take a look at it, and then now you tell me what you saw. You know what a typical response would be? You would have all seen very many different things in the same thing. Although the same picture will be in front of you, some people would have eyes, or I would say the body gravitates towards certain parts. It gravitates to a certain kind, it will hold on to some parts in that. painting. For some, they may recognize this kind of a balance between these two. Some might see it as something else, etc. So there are very many different phenomenological, that is experiential ways in which we engage the painting. And but even in a very non-symmetric painting like this, okay, non-obviously non-symmetric painting, there are a lot of principles of symmetry and symmetry breaking which is present, and these are far more simpler examples. What I'm trying to say is, even if you look at ritual art like the mandalas and so on, you have very elaborate symmetries in each of the, we do this rangoli painting. You look at the rangolis you do, you will see the kind of symmetries that are present in rangolis. In fact, mathematicians classify different rangolis based on the different type of symmetries they all possess. And again, similarly, you have seen many of these, the batik art, the Calcutta sari art, various kinds of these practices all illustrate some kind of, so symmetry is a kind of order, replacement, a mirror image. So you can see there are at least two mirrors happening here. One, a mirror I can put in the center here like this, and this gets mirrored. I can also put a mirror like this and it gets mirrored. Right? So there are two types of symmetry. There could be other kinds of symmetry in each of these figures, etc. And so in some sense, what it is trying to show is that symmetry seems to have something to do with the way in which we look at the world. It gives a kind of a balance, it gives various other kinds of ordering of our vision itself. One of the most important examples from Indian art is, of course, the dancing Nataraja. And the dancing Nataraja is a classic example of very complex symmetries. Okay, this is a idol from 1279, 13th century, and this is a very interesting principle. So people are trying to look at what is the kind of symmetry, and the dancing Nataraja has great significance to some of the foundational principles in dance and in art. So if you look at Natya Shastra, the very important foundational text, at least as a text-wise tradition within the so-called classical written tradition, it is actually a set of manual of principles to do with natya, also about dance, theater, and music. And when you talk about a figure like this, there are a lot of many significances to what this kind of figure represents, but there's also a very important figure about some foundational principles of symmetry embodied in this thing. The closest example, I'm sure all of you have seen the dancing Nataraja, but many of you may also have seen this more famous drawing by Leonardo da Vinci. I don't want to call it painting, the Vitruvian Man. And this is another very famous example of the kind of influence of Leonardo da Vinci's time on principles of symmetry in a lot of paintings during that period, in Renaissance period, post-Renaissance, the kind of principles of organizing vision, principles of repetition, principles of mirroring, which were all very integral to the such figures. So you can see one example of the different kind of symmetries present in just a simple figure like this. Okay, so each of these, when you look at it this way, it's not that you're reducing it to geometry, you're reducing it to these principles of what, as I said, people call as symmetry, and you can do a similar thing for the dancing Nataraja to see what are the different kinds of patterns and repetitions and symmetries which are actually present. And as you can see from both these diagrams, they're actually quite complex. Now, you might say this is all just a game of showing repetition and order, so why should we be so much worried about it? We are not worried about it, but we find that this principle keeps repeating so much, we are trying to understand what could it mean and what is its significance. What does it say about us, about our cognitive capacities, about our visual capacities, that these kind of principles keep repeating? In the case of architecture, again, as I said, considering science and art and science of buildings, obviously it's very, you should not be surprised that symmetry plays a very important principle in architecture. And golden ratio is one of the first principles you probably have learned in architecture, the ratio of, do you remember how much it is, the ratio, approximately? Something like 1.6. Okay, it's actually not exactly 1.6, but the closest approximation is 8/5. So what could it mean? So you could ask, for example, the question, why is the height of this building, right? And you have the ratio of these rooms, length, breadth, and height. Imagine if I built this like a square room, everything is the same. Imagine a room that you go to, let's say ordinary, your own hostel rooms, let's say. Your hostel rooms would be, let's say, 10 feet. Are they square rooms or what kind of rooms are they? What is the geometry of your hostel rooms? I mean, those of you who stay in hostels. Okay, you go now measure them and see approximately. See what kind is the height going to be the same as the other dimensions of the room, or is it better? Suppose you go into some hotel lobbies and you see the height is much longer than the width. Does it give you a better sense? Is your experience in that space different? What is that relation which makes you feel most comfortable in a space? That principle, that's fundamental principle of architecture. What is that ratio? Why should height of a room be 10 feet? Because that's a standard thing. Now, when you build anything, the first thing an builder or architect will come, they'll draw a diagram and say 10 feet. I've never understood why it should be exactly 10 feet. Okay, I can understand the door level as 7 feet because you say, okay, at least you're 6 feet height, etc. Why 10 feet? Why not something more? What will it be? Is it just functional? If you say it's for cost, why not 9 feet? I don't know. You are the architect students, right? So if you come to build my house, I'm going to ask you this question. So you better know what you're going to tell me because I'm your client. You'll say, oh, I want to build 10. No, I say, no, I want 9 feet. And then you'll have to say something. No, you'll say, oh, no, it's aesthetic, something you might say. You're actually talking in terms of the importance of golden ratio in human perception. Again, a puzzle. Why is it that we are so comfortable with this kind of a golden ratio, right? The 1.6 ratio. But what is fascinating is that the Fibonacci sequence is actually related to golden ratio. So look at the way in which these very complex patterns arise in our thing. So in art, in architecture, again there are deviations from symmetry are very important. And again, like in art and science, nature, there are functions of symmetry which includes stability, efficiency, etc. And also there is an aesthetic function. So I'm just checking the time to make sure I'm not just going on. Yeah. So there is something very interesting about symmetry in architecture, which is of particularly great interest to me, and that I want to explore that with you because it's such a fascinating point of discussion. And I'll come to it and talk about it a little bit by asking the question: okay, there is symmetry in architecture. We can reduce that to a symmetry of a building, but is there more? Is there something far more interesting happening in architecture as compared to art and nature? And my point is going to be that there is something very interesting, and that's philosophically so important. And I hope at the end of it, you're going to say, well, I want to go read some philosophy now to make sense of what you are learning as an architect. This is a very classic instance of symmetries in architecture. Okay, there are so many of these foundational buildings that you see which will show this kind of very traditional kind of symmetries which are present. And of course, there are many kinds of symmetries which are present within a building like this. But you can just see the radial one, the mirror image one is one simple one, and you can actually explore this, and it can be represented in many, many different ways. This is a Japanese building. Here the symmetry is not just in the function of the building per se. There's also something very interesting about the mirror reflection, which is used as a literal mirror, which is the water body, which functions as a mirror of the building, and therefore your experience of the building is always more than the building. So what is the experience of the building? The building is not just what you see in a postcard. When you go and stand in front of a building, there is a sense, a visceral sense of experiencing that building. And when you have symmetry forms like this, the way you experience a building radically changes. Right? And I'm sure that's something which you'll all learn as architecture students. When you design buildings, you can look at other kinds of more complex symmetries, more modern buildings. Okay, these are all very, very symmetrical figures of, you can actually map the kind of symmetries they have. And one of my very favorite building, the Blue Mosque in Istanbul, again, both inside and outside, it's such a beautiful building, such a beautiful, and even the principles of building and the kind of symmetry principles which are present in it. Now, the symmetry principle, they're not doing it like mathematicians. When they build that space, you enter that space and you look at it, it's a completely different experience. That symmetry is doing something to the way you engage with the building. It's not just about doing something for mathematical reasons or for stability. In fact, you can build very unstable buildings, right? But you need to invest a lot in terms of how you support one side or other side, etc. I mean, those are things which you know far better. But there is something about this experiential nature of buildings which are very much important. And there's a very famous modern building which people have been talking about a lot, which I found in the net. Another famous example of a very symmetric building, right? I presume most of you know what this is. Okay. No, and I was looking at Symmetry and they said, oh, this is a very famous photo of a very, and you can go now explore what kind of symmetries are actually present in this famous photo. Is that where we were walking or is it another place? That's it. Okay. So you can look at it anywhere. I mean, you, as I said, there are very different ways in exploring what these kinds of symmetries are. So, after having told you all this, then we had to answer finally some questions on what is actually symmetry and why are we making such a big fuss about it. And the quick answer to that is that there is something very deep philosophical significance about symmetry. And the first clue of this comes from mathematics and sciences. And there's a very simple definition of symmetry. After talking to you about all these pictures of symmetry, now I don't have any more pictures. I've done with my pictures. All the good part of the talk is over. Now I'm just going to tell you some more conceptual ideas about talking about what kind of definition of symmetry can we work with. And one of the most important, oh, there's one more picture left, sorry, is that, symmetry, the definition of symmetry is invariance under transformation. And this is actually a very wonderful principle. It's saying a very simple principle. Anytime you make a change, and if the thing remains the same, then it possesses that particular symmetry. That's a general principle. And I'll give you some examples of it so you see what I'm saying. But this idea that when you change something, something remains the same, is actually of great interest to philosophy. And it's one of the first founding questions in philosophy. And what is the founding principle? That, okay, so when you look at an example of typical geometric shapes as this, like circle, triangle, etc., you know what I mean. You take a circle, you turn it a little bit, you rotate it. It remains the same. You can't make any distinction, right? You can't make out it's changed. You turn it by 1 degree, 10 degree, 20 degree, 180 degrees, 360 degrees, it looks the same. Therefore, under each of this transformation, it is invariant, it doesn't change. Then we say it is symmetric under rotation. That is, under the activity, under the change of rotation, it remains invariant, it doesn't change. So suppose I take a square instead of a circle and I turn it by 10 degrees. You immediately say, well, it looks different. The form hasn't changed, but when I look at it, immediately there's a kind of a difference. So you might say, well, that's that's not symmetrical to this square, but you rotate it by 90 degrees, it looks the same. So you could say it is invariant under rotation by 90. So the different types of symmetries are nothing but different types of invariance. So in a circle, all changes, 1 degree, 100 degree, 1000 degrees, is still the same. Whereas in a square, it may not be. So what we mean by symmetry is, what are those kinds of changes under which that object remains invariant. This is very simple to see in terms of geometrical things. So yeah, this is the picture I forgot. So you can have different kinds of, in the first case, it's called an identity transformation. Second one, it is rotated by 120, as you can see, the black spot comes to bottom, and similarly 240 degree this thing goes, etc. Reflection is, put a mirror and see what happens. That's what reflection is, and so on. So you can see this is what we mean by symmetry, and whenever it is invariant, under whatever change you do, then you say it possesses that symmetry within it. So symmetry, you can have mirror symmetry, rotational symmetry, translation symmetry, etc. Now, why are scientists so worried about it and so excited about it? First, the larger problem which philosophy is concerned with is, as I said, the question of change. And there's something very interesting about change. When you talk about change is always defined with respect to something. And the simplest example I can tell you is a leaf. You take a leaf which is green in color and it changes to brown. Now, so I look at a green leaf and then I look at a brown leaf. Why do I say it's the same leaf? When I say the leaf has changed from green to brown, I am also saying it is the same leaf but the color has changed. Why don't you call that a new leaf compared to the old leaf? I'm puzzled. I don't know why. Do you know why? I mean, can you think of why you would call it why don't you call it a new leaf? Because one is brown, the one was green. Why would you even think that they are the same when they look so different? Or to make your life more miserable, when you are born, you are like this, right? You didn't look anything like what you look now. You didn't think like what you thought now. And now you are like this. And I want to tell you a sad truth which your parents haven't told. Who you are today is not the same person whom you were as a child. They're two different things, completely two different things. Yeah? Would you agree? Yeah, everybody agrees. Tomorrow you have to change your name. So what your name is today is not tomorrow. You will have to go to this your whatever you do it in your admin and say change my name. Every day you have to change. Every moment you have to change your name. Why do you think you're the same? Okay, tell me at least this. Why would you think you're the same? Okay, it's not such a difficult question, right? Okay, first of all, do you accept you have changed from a child to now? Let's start with very basic. You accept that at least? You sure? Why? Okay, some of course you have changed. What was your height when you're born? Yeah, and now you're very different, right? So you accept that. Then why is it the same? Why are you the same person who has changed from that to this? What is it? Okay, at least in the leaf, there's a green leaf, and you can go on staring at the leaf, it becomes brown. You can say, you know what, it's the same leaf which has become brown. Only the color has changed. In terms of the leaf, what about you? No, internal organs when you are born, I can tell you, your heart would have been so small, yeah. If your internal organs were as big as you are now, and as a child, your whole child size would have been so much, right? And one thing definitely is a lot more than a child is our stomach. Why would you think you are the same person? Okay, this is actually um, such an important question in philosophy. A lot of philosophy begins with this kind of a question, and it's related to questions of identity and change. And just so that I don't keep on boring you about this question, although I would like you to think about it, there is an answer. Should I tell you the answer now, or you think about it? Well, think about it, and then you ask me. Then we'll talk about it and give you the answer. So then because giving once you get an answer, you say, oh yeah, yeah, yeah. But I think once you think about it and you yourself come to that kind of a thing, you'll remember it far more. So, in the case of a color, you think that something remains the same, but something changes. Every change you say is a change of the same thing means that something remains the same. What you say, the substratum of the leaf remains the same, the basis of the leaf remains the same, the color has changed. Okay, now think about it in the context of all of you as children to now, and you'll see what I'm trying to say. In the context of symmetry, symmetry is about change and something remains invariant, right? And what I want to point out is that the idea of a symmetry has very deeply related to something which is unchanging in the back, and that's such a fundamental principle, and we learn that primarily from physics. So I'm going to talk about physics, just want to show you why in physics this has become such a most important concept. I would say that modern physics begins with the idea of symmetry as a fundamental principle. In fact, if it says one fundamental principle of what we call as particle physics or modern physics, it is the idea of symmetry. The recognition that particles in this universe, what we call as what physicists call as fundamental particles, the particles which make up what the universe is, like your electrons and protons and so on, they all exhibit very fascinating symmetries. Not in terms of form and shape, not in terms of the size. Nobody knows what the size of an electron is. So if you wanted to harass my physics teachers, one thing you would always ask them is, oh, you say the electron is circular and proton is circular. They draw such pictures, and you ask them, is it really spherical in shape? And they'll get really pissed off because nobody knows what shape. And you can't even talk about shapes of these particles. So the idea of symmetry is far more deeper than just saying it is spherical and so on. And I'll just give you one example of why the idea of symmetry is so important. The argument is that there are things called laws of nature. That, I'm sure all of you, even if you're not science students, you remember Newton's laws, law of gravity, law of motion, etc. So there are laws of nature, according to which nature behaves in particular manner. Objects in nature behave under these laws. Now, these laws, all the laws of nature, which control how objects should behave, including all human objects, are obey principles of symmetry. And one of the most important laws in physics is what are called the conservation laws. Conservation laws, again, you would have not studied in school. Conservation of mass, right? Mass is never lost or created. What if you have 1 kilo of mass and you can break it, do whatever it is, you take the dust, you take all the parts, it will still be 1 kilograms. It cannot be more or less. You cannot lose mass like that, classically speaking. And similarly, there is something called conservation of momentum. So when you have two billiard balls, balls hitting each other, one billiard ball will hit one and that will go away somewhere. If you look at the total momentum before collision and total momentum after collision, they will be the same. These are fundamental principles and so important in understanding the basic nature of classical physics. I mean, without it, in fact, for me, this is all you need to know to understand physics. Not very difficult to do physics in that sense, right? Conservation of momentum, energy is never lost or gained. Whatever energy you put in, somehow or the other, it will always be the same. How do we understand these principles of nature? Why should nature follow these laws? And the way in which physicists understand it is to say that all these conservation laws all are because there is a particular symmetry. Okay, and if you're not science students and if you think, oh, this is too much for you to understand, let me at least keep this in your mind as you learn more, and I'm sure you'll think about this, you'll understand the significance of it. What I'm trying to say is, even the reason, or let me put it this way, the reason why a 1 kilogram mass can never lose mass, even when you break it down, the mass always has to be the same on both sides, is because of a conservation law. The reason why when two billiard balls hit and the total momentum, right? Mass into velocity. Let's say the velocity by which it hits is the same after collision, before and after collision, is because of a consequence of what is called isotropic symmetry and so on. In other words, the most important principles of nature, the most important laws of nature, which is matter is neither lost nor gained, energy is neither lost nor gained, are because of certain symmetries in nature. And that's why scientists are it becomes something very fundamental for physics, and as I said, it is the foundational concept in a discipline like particle physics and so on. And symmetry is also more than just these kind of principles. It's also more than form and shape. Like as I told you about fundamental particles, you can find principles of symmetry in language, you can see it in writing, you can see it in music. There are a lot of very interesting accounts of how symmetry is very important in music. Symmetry could be in what, like I said, repetition, mirroring. So you might have a phrase of music and you mirror it. So suppose you say sariga, and then you could say garisa, or a kind of a mirroring. As if we put a mirror, that's how it will look. So there are, in classical music, there are a lot of these kinds of phrases which you produce very intricate patterns. And perhaps your recognition of the beauty of music is based on the kind of these symmetry principles present in music. So it goes back fundamentally to something which I think is about what we are. So I'm going to just, since I want to come to the last part, and I think I have a few more minutes, about 5 minutes or so. I'll try and come back to this question that one of the things in which many of these examples of symmetry, as I said, change needs something which is unchanging. All the examples of symmetry that he spoke about need space which is unchanging. And to me, one of the most interesting questions, which is also of particular relevance to the question of architecture, is a question of what is space. There's a very deep engagement between philosophy of space and architecture. And presumably by the time you finish your course, you'll do a lot more about it. But I just want to leave you with some simple things for you to think about in the context of space, because if there's one thing which architects deal with much more than any other human practice, it is this idea of space. It is your engagement with the idea of space that is so fundamental to what architecture does. And if you think of space as just something which is emptiness, etc., that itself is a very interesting philosophical topic. But what exactly is this context of space that we're talking about? Just emptiness? Then why are we talking about space as if it is there? There is space in this room. It's just like saying there are chairs in this room. There is space in this room. What is your understanding of space? What is your grasping of the concept of space? Now, we know that space is very important in architecture. So, there are two ways I'll just leave with you to think about. Okay, one is the simple question of asking yourself, do architects talk about space as experiencing space? I mean, the architects I know often do talk about it, and a lot of literature on it also talks about it, and we also know it. I enter into a big building which has very different geometry. I experience space in some sense. What does it mean to say I experience space? This is the only philosophy word I'll leave with you, because I don't want you to sit through a whole philosophy talk and say, well, at least one philosophy word I'll leave with you, one concept. This is ontology of space. What does ontology of space mean? Ontology is what kind of object is space. Suppose space is real. Suppose a chair is real. Why do you say chair is real? Because you can see it, touch it, sit on it, etc. Right? You say chair is real. Would you say space is real? Can you touch space? Taste it? You put your tongue out and can you taste it? Or maybe smell it? Why would you say space is real? What can you touch it? So, is space real or unreal? Is there space around you or not? Okay. I'm not trying to put you in a spot, but think about it. It's a fascinating question. Go and think about it, because there's no easy, quick answers to it. But you ask yourself, what then constitutes the reality? Why do we talk about it as if space is around me? In what sense is that I can't do anything about it? I don't know what kind of. That's why when you say ontology of spaces, we're asking what kind of reality does space have? And yet, architects make a career out of space, right? With all apologies to architects, but I'm saying they love this concept. They want to talk about, I have one very nice definition of space as a sculpting of architecture as a sculpting of space. So I like to see architects as making a sculpture out of this empty space. And I can really see some architects who walk into a space like this, they can see things, what to do in this space, which, as I said, untrained eyes like me, I won't know what. I'll just say, oh, yeah. They'll immediately see things in this thing. They can immediately, like theater, very good theater stage, artists, art directors and stuff. They enter a stage, they know exactly what they want. They're already seeing things on stage in that space, which is otherwise empty to us. So the space has a very interesting questions around what we call as philosophy of space. As I said, I'm not going to bore you with all that. I just want to leave this point with you, because I want you to think about it when you learn architecture, when you do your other classes. That although we talk about space and the eyes as the context, there is a tradition in philosophy which makes the argument that body is the central point of experience of space. In fact, what I will say is there is no space as such. This thing, emptiness around me. The space to me arises in the way I orient my body. It's my body orientation which produces the concept of space. Okay, there's a lot in this. I'm just saying it quickly to you, but I also thought about whether I should even tell you this, but I thought I wanted to leave it with you. If there's any questions, we can talk about it. But this is something which has to be there with you when you sit in your studio, when you're designing, when you're listening to what you're learning in class. Ask yourself about what is the space around me that I'm talking about? What am I doing with this thing called space? How do I understand the idea of space in architecture? Is it that the function of an architect is to produce a space, not assume there is space around you? You may think you're only producing a building. You may think you're producing walls and whatever, roof and walls. But you're doing something more. There is a particular kind of, I think a good building is one which has to animate my body. It's not about good color here and there and say, oh, that's nice design, etc. In which your body's experience when you enter that space has to change. Because we respond to space through our body. It is just like if I don't have space to turn, I'm going to live like this, right? But when I enter a space, it is a completely different experience of what happens to my body. So, as I said, there's a lot of very interesting things about that, and I just want to leave that with you to think about. And so, the way to think about it is the final points about thinking about how to do that, how to help you think about it is ask yourself, We use the word space in a very generic term. Yeah, space. This room has space. You go to your hostel, there's space. You go to a classroom, there is space. Begin to ask yourself the question: what is there something qualitatively different about space that you can imagine, that you can envision, that you can engage with? That this space in this room, space is not that kind of a completely homogeneous thing. That the space in your hostel is different from the space here and different from somewhere. And if you think that, ask yourself why. Ask yourself, what is my idea of space that is producing these different experiences of space? Okay. And I know it might look like, okay, a very abstract concept, but I'm saying it is so central to architecture, and either you can do the whole thing of what you do without thinking about this fundamental concept, or use this opportunity to start asking yourself in every